Catherine belonged to a loving Christian family. She was the only child of her parents, and they adored her deeply. Her early years were filled with joy and laughter. Their home was always warm with love, and Catherine's parents made sure she never felt alone. They would take her to church every Sunday, where she loved listening to the choir and admiring the stained glass windows. Her parents dreamed of giving her the best life possible and always reminded her that faith would guide her through life's challenges. One bright morning when Catherine was just 8 years old, her parents decided to visit her uncle who lived in a nearby town. Catherine was excited about the trip, but due to some urgent work, her parents decided to leave her at home with a neighbor. "We'll be back soon, my love," her mother had said, kissing her forehead. Catherine waved them goodbye, unaware that this would be the last time she'd see them alive. Hours passed, and Catherine waited eagerly for their return. As evening fell, she sat by the window watching the road anxiously. Suddenly, there was a loud knock at the door. The neighbor answered it, and Catherine heard hushed voices. The expressions on their faces had turned grim. The neighbor's eyes were filled with sorrow as she knelt down and held Catherine's tiny hands. "Sweetheart, there's been an accident," she whispered gently. Catherine's heart sank. "What do you mean? Are they okay?" she asked, her voice trembling with fear. The neighbor's silence told her everything she needed to know. Tears welled up in Catherine's eyes as she screamed, "No! They promised they'd come back." She ran to the door, wanting to see them, but was held back. The accident was devastating. Their car had collided with a speeding truck on the highway. The impact was so severe that neither of them survived. Catherine's world came crashing down in an instant. She couldn't believe that the people who loved her the most were gone forever. Over the next few days, the house was filled with mourners, but Catherine felt empty inside. She clutched her mother's key scarf tightly, refusing to let go, and cried herself to sleep every night. The once joyful home now felt cold and lifeless. Little did she know, her life was about to change even more in ways she could never have imagined. After the tragic death of Catherine's parents, her life took a painful turn. She was just a helpless child, expecting to find comfort in the arms of her relatives. However, fate had something else in store for her. Catherine's uncle, who had initially promised to take care of her, soon changed his mind. "We have our own family to look after," he told the others, trying to avoid responsibility. The rest of the relatives whispered among themselves, unwilling to bear the burden of raising an orphaned girl. "She's too young. She'll be a responsibility," one aunt said. Another uncle suggested sending her to a boarding school, but no one was ready to take her in as their own. The family politics became intense, with each relative finding excuses to avoid helping. Catherine, too young to understand their indifference, waited silently, hoping someone would take her home. But days turned into weeks, and finally her uncle made a decision that would change her life forever. He sent her to an orphanage. The orphanage was nothing like the warm, loving home she once knew. The cold, gray walls and strict routines felt suffocating. Catherine struggled to adjust to her new life, where kindness was rare and loneliness was her only companion. She missed her parents terribly, spending sleepless nights crying silently into her pillow. The other children at the orphanage were not always kind, and she often found herself feeling isolated. Despite the hardships, Catherine found solace in the church within the orphanage grounds. She would sit in the pews for hours, staring at the flickering candles and whispering prayers for her parents' peace. She believed that through devotion and prayer, she could connect with them and bring them peace in the afterlife. As the years passed, Catherine's faith deepened. She found comfort in the church's teachings and the presence of the nuns who guided her. Their kindness and dedication inspired her, and slowly she realized that perhaps she could find her purpose within the walls of faith. By the time she turned 18, Catherine had made her decision. she would dedicate her life to serving God and become a nun. If I can't have my parents back, at least I can pray for their souls every day, she told herself. The church became her new home, and she embraced the strict discipline and rigorous routine with a sense of purpose. Her journey to becoming a nun was not easy. She had to undergo intense training, learning the scriptures, practicing humility, and surrendering herself to a life of service. The early mornings, long hours of prayer, and the sacrifice of worldly desires required immense strength, but Catherine never wavered. Finally, after years of dedication, she took her vows and became Sister Catherine. Clad in her habit, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. In the quiet of the church, she found solace, believing that through her devotion she was bringing peace to her parents' souls. Little did she know, her journey as a nun would soon take a dark and unexpected turn. Catherine had dedicated her entire life to serving the church. After taking her vows, she moved into the hostel adjacent to the church, where she lived a simple and disciplined life. Her days were filled with prayers, church services, and helping those in need. She cleaned the church halls, arranged the prayer books, and assisted in organizing community events. The little money she earned from her work was enough for her basic needs: food, clothing, and offerings. Catherine never complained. She believed her true wealth lay in her devotion to God. Every morning she would wake up before dawn, light candles in the church, and spend hours in meditation. The peaceful ambiance of the church gave her a sense of fulfillment, and she found joy in helping others find solace through faith. Despite the quiet and disciplined routine, Catherine always felt a void, something beyond the physical world that troubled her heart. One day, Father Joseph, the senior priest of the church, noticed Catherine's deep interest in spiritual matters beyond the ordinary. He called her aside and said, "Catherine, faith is powerful, but sometimes darkness tries to challenge it. Would you like to learn how to fight the forces of evil?" Catherine, curious yet determined, nodded eagerly. Thus began her journey into learning the art of breaking black magic. Father Joseph, who had years of experience dealing with cases of dark forces, taught Catherine the sacred prayers, holy rituals, and protective verses from the scriptures. She learned how to identify the signs of black magic, unexplained illnesses, eerie disturbances, and sudden misfortunes. Catherine practiced the art of using blessed water, burning sacred herbs, and reciting protective prayers that could cleanse homes and souls of dark influences. Father Joseph also taught her the importance of faith and patience in dealing with those under the influence of evil forces. As days turned into weeks, Catherine's knowledge grew stronger. She assisted Father Joseph in cleansing rituals, witnessing firsthand the terrifying effects of black magic on people's lives. Slowly, she developed the courage and skill to perform minor exorcisms on her own. Despite the frightening encounters she faced, Catherine remained steadfast in her belief that God's power was stronger than any dark force. She knew that with every prayer she was not only fighting evil, but also protecting innocent souls. However, Catherine had no idea that her newfound knowledge would soon be put to the ultimate test, one that would challenge her faith like never before. One quiet afternoon, as Catherine sat in the church, deep in prayer, the soft sound of footsteps interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to see Father Joseph standing at the altar, his expression grave. "Catherine, I need you to come with me," he said gently. Without hesitation, Catherine followed him to a small room inside the church. As she stepped inside, she saw a frail young woman sitting in a chair, her hands trembling and her face pale as a ghost. Dark circles framed her hollow eyes, and her lips were cracked and dry. She looked like someone who hadn't slept in days. Her hair was unkempt, and her skin, once fair and glowing, had turned dull and lifeless. There was an eerie emptiness in her gaze, as if she was staring into an unseen abyss. Catherine's heart sank. She had seen suffering before, but there was something different about Elisa, something sinister lurking beneath her fragile appearance. Father Joseph placed a comforting hand on Elisa's shoulder and turned to Catherine. "This is Elisa," he said softly. "She has been experiencing strange things." Catherine nodded, waiting for him to continue. "Elisa has been under the influence of black magic," Father Joseph revealed in a low voice. "She feels a dark presence around her at all times. At night she hears whispers, shadows move around her, and she feels something pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe." Tears welled up in Elisa's eyes as she spoke in a trembling voice. I, I feel like I'm being watched. No matter where I go, something follows me. I hear footsteps when no one is there. My health is getting worse, and my dreams, they're filled with terrifying things." Her voice cracked as she buried her face in her hands. Father Joseph sighed heavily. "Her family has tried everything, doctors, medicines, prayers, but nothing has worked. Catherine, I believe you are ready to face this challenge. I want you to go to Elisa's house and perform the rituals to break this curse." Catherine hesitated for a moment, feeling a wave of nervousness. This would be her first solo task, and the weight of responsibility was immense. But seeing the desperation in Elisa's eyes, she knew she couldn't refuse. "I'll do it," Catherine said firmly, determination replacing her fear. Father Joseph handed Catherine a small bag containing holy water, blessed salt, and sacred scriptures. "Be careful, Catherine. Dark forces don't give up easily." With a final prayer, Catherine took Elisa's trembling hand and reassured her, "Have faith, Elisa. We will fight this together." As they left the church, a cold wind blew through the air, as if warning Catherine that something sinister was waiting for her at Elisa's home. That very day, following Father Joseph's instructions, Catherine packed her essentials and accompanied Elisa to her home. As they arrived at the house, an unsettling chill ran down Catherine's spine. The house stood tall, yet seemed to hold a heavy silence, as if something dark lurked within. Upon entering, Catherine noticed the dim lighting and the eerie stillness that filled the air. The walls were adorned with religious symbols, yet there was an unsettling darkness that overshadowed them. Elisa's husband greeted them at the door, his eyes filled with concern and exhaustion. "Thank you for coming, sister," he said in a tired voice. As Catherine stepped inside, she observed an elderly woman sitting in a corner, her hands constantly moving over prayer beads, whispering verses under her breath. Elisa's mother-in-law, a frail yet sharp-eyed woman, wore a permanent expression of devotion. Despite her pious appearance, something about her felt off to Catherine. An air of cold detachment surrounded her. The woman barely acknowledged Catherine's presence, her eyes flickering for a moment before returning to her prayers. Catherine could sense the uneasiness in Elisa as she led her to her room. The room was cluttered and filled with a strange heaviness. Burnt incense sticks, melted candles, and torn pieces of cloth lay scattered in a corner, as if someone had been attempting rituals. "This is where I feel it the most," Elisa whispered, trembling. Wasting no time, Catherine unpacked her bag and set up her tools, holy water, blessed salt, and sacred scriptures. She lit a small candle and began reciting protective prayers, sprinkling holy water around the room. As she chanted, the atmosphere in the room started to change. The air grew thick and shadows seemed to dance across the walls. Suddenly, Elisa gasped. "Did you see that?" she whispered, pointing towards the window. Catherine turned but saw nothing. "Stay strong," Catherine reassured her, continuing with the cleansing process. Throughout the night, Catherine remained vigilant, reciting verses from the scriptures and placing protective charms around the house. The first night passed uneventfully, though Catherine couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The elderly mother-in-law never left her prayer corner, her whispers echoing through the house like an unsettling lullaby. On the second day, Catherine intensified her efforts. She carefully moved through each room, blessing it and ensuring no dark energy remained. When she reached the kitchen, she noticed strange symbols carved under the dining table, symbols she recognized from her studies with Father Joseph. They were signs of black magic, meant to trap and weaken the victim. Catherine immediately destroyed them, sprinkling holy water and reciting powerful prayers to break their hold. As night fell, the house grew colder. Catherine could hear distant murmurs that sent chills down her spine. She continued praying, clutching her cross tightly. At one point, Elisa screamed in her sleep, thrashing violently. Catherine rushed to her side and placed her hand over Elisa's forehead, reciting verses to calm her. Slowly, the screaming subsided, and Elisa drifted into a peaceful slumber. By the end of the second day, Catherine felt the air in the house lighten. The heaviness, the suffocating fear seemed to lift. She knew the dark presence had weakened. After ensuring that every corner of the house was cleansed, she packed her belongings. Before leaving, Catherine looked at Elise Cisa and her husband. "I've done everything I can," she said softly. "Continue your prayers and keep your faith strong. Evil only thrives where there is fear." Elisa hugged Catherine tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, sister. I feel lighter, as if something has been lifted off me." As Catherine stepped out of the house, a strange feeling lingered in her heart. Though she had performed the cleansing, something still felt unfinished. The old woman's presence nagged at her thoughts, but she chose to focus on the hope that Elisa was finally free from the dark forces. Little did Catherine know this battle was far from over. Something far more sinister was still lurking within those walls, waiting for the right moment to strike again. A few days had passed since Catherine returned to the church, believing she had freed Elisa from the grip of black magic. One night, just as Catherine had drifted into a deep sleep at her hostel, the shrill ringing of her phone shattered the silence. Groggy and disoriented, she fumbled to answer it. "Catherine, Catherine, please come. He's here," Elisa's voice whispered through the phone, her tone trembling with fear. Catherine immediately sat up, her heart pounding in her chest. "Elisa, what's happening?" she asked, trying to stay calm. Elisa's breathing was ragged, and there was an eerie silence on the other end of the line, broken only by faint whispers. "He's here. He said he'll kill me if you don't come." Her voice trailed off into a muffled sob. Catherine felt a chill run down her spine. "Who? Who is there?" she asked, but Elisa's voice had turned into a panicked murmur. "It's him. It's the darkness. It's inside the house. I can't escape." Catherine could hear objects crashing in the background, followed by the sound of Elisa crying. "Please, Catherine, please come before it's too late," Elisa whispered, her voice now trembling so much that it was barely audible. Panic surged through Catherine's veins. She had sensed something lingering at Elisa's house, but she had convinced herself it was gone. Now, hearing Elisa's helplessness, she knew the dark force was still present, and it was angrier than before. Without wasting another second, Catherine grabbed her coat and holy kit, rushing out of the hostel into the dark, deserted streets. Her mind raced with questions and fears. Was she too late? Would Elisa still be alive by the time she arrived? As she ran, the phone remained pressed against her ear, but Elisa's murmuring had grown fainter, almost as if something was taking over her voice. "Elisa, stay with me. Keep praying. I'm on my way," Catherine shouted desperately, but the call ended with a chilling static noise. Catherine's heart pounded as she sprinted towards Elisa's house, bracing herself for the unknown horror waiting for her inside. Catherine arrived at Elisa's house at exactly 12:30 a.m. The street was eerily silent, with only the soft rustling of leaves echoing through the cold night air. As she approached the house, an unsettling chill gripped her, sending shivers down her spine. The main gate stood ajar, creaking softly in the breeze, as if it had been left open in a hurry. Clutching the silver cross hanging around her neck, Catherine whispered a protective prayer under her breath. Her footsteps were cautious and her hands trembled slightly as she stepped inside. The moment she crossed the threshold, an overwhelming sense of dread settled over her. Inside, the house was in complete disarray. Chairs were overturned, glass lay shattered across the floor, and dark red handprints smeared the walls. The lights flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. A broken picture frame of Elisa and her husband lay on the floor, the glass cracked into jagged pieces. "Elisa!" Catherine called out, her voice barely above a whisper. No response. The silence was suffocating. The air smelled of something damp and metallic. Blood. Catherine's heartbeat quickened as she moved further inside, carefully stepping over the broken furniture. As she entered the dimly lit kitchen, the sight that met her eyes sent a wave of horror through her body. There, crouched inside the kitchen cabinet, was Elisa. Her fragile body trembled violently, and her wide, terrified eyes stared blankly at Catherine. Blood dripped from a deep wound on her forehead, staining her pale face. Her clothes were torn and disheveled, and her hands clutched her chest as if trying to protect herself from something unseen. Catherine rushed to her, but Elisa flinched, whispering incoherent words under her breath. "He's here. He won't leave me alone. He wants me to suffer," Elisa murmured, her voice trembling with fear. Catherine knelt beside her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "It's okay, Elisa. I'm here now. We will fight this," she said reassuringly, though deep down she felt the suffocating presence of something dark lurking nearby. Suddenly, a sharp gust of wind blew through the house, slamming the door shut behind them. The flickering lights grew dimmer, and a cold draft wrapped around them like invisible hands. Catherine tightened her grip on Elisa, feeling the energy in the house grow heavier by the second. She quickly retrieved the vial of holy water from her bag and began sprinkling it around the kitchen, reciting sacred verses to cleanse the space. As she prayed, Elisa's trembling began to ease, but the oppressive presence in the house remained strong. A loud, guttural growl echoed through the empty halls, sending a jolt of terror through Catherine's body. Elisa let out a weak sob and clung to Catherine. "It's her. She won't let me go," she whimpered, her eyes darting to the doorway, where a shadow flickered briefly before disappearing. Catherine knew they couldn't stay here any longer. "We need to leave, Elisa," she said firmly, helping her to her feet. Elisa, weak and frightened, nodded silently. As they made their way toward the front door, every step felt heavier, as though something was trying to hold them back. The air thickened and faint whispers surrounded them, growing louder with every step. Catherine pushed forward, praying louder, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her heart. With a final desperate effort, they stumbled out of the house into the cold night air. The moment they stepped outside, the suffocating weight seemed to lift slightly, but Catherine knew the fight was far from over. As she guided Elisa toward the car, she turned back to look at the dark silhouette standing in the window, watching, waiting. Catherine held Elisa tightly, whispering calming prayers as she gently stroked her hair. Elisa's breathing was still ragged, and her body trembled from the terrifying experience she had just faced. After a few minutes, Catherine looked into Elisa's teary eyes and softly asked, "What happened, Elisa? Tell me everything." Elisa wiped her face with shaky hands and began speaking in a trembling voice. I was sleeping, but suddenly I felt something heavy pressing down on my chest. I couldn't move or scream. It felt like an invisible force was trying to choke me." Her voice broke as she continued. "Then I heard a whisper, a terrifying voice. It told me that I shouldn't have tried to break the magic, that I'll pay for it. Catherine's heart sank. She knew that the evil force wasn't gone yet, and it was still after Alisa. But something wasn't adding up. She glanced around the house, the broken furniture, the shattered glass, the eerie darkness that still lingered in the air. Everything pointed to a supernatural attack. But amidst all this chaos, one thing stood out: Alisa's mother-in-law. In the corner of the house, Alisa's elderly mother-in-law lay sound asleep, her face calm and undisturbed. Catherine found it strange. "She slept through all this?" Catherine asked in disbelief. Alisa nodded weakly. "She took her sleeping pills like she always does. She said she doesn't want to be disturbed by my problems," Alisa whispered, looking toward the old woman with a strange mixture of fear and uncertainty. Catherine's instincts kicked in. Something about the mother-in-law didn't feel right. She quietly moved closer to the sleeping woman and observed her. The air around her was oddly still, and despite the eerie disturbances in the house, the woman looked peaceful, as if nothing had happened. Later that night, Catherine sat alone in Alisa's room, clutching her Bible and reciting protective prayers. As she continued reading, a realization hit her like a bolt of lightning. The clues were all there: the attacks, the whispers, the fear Alisa had been living with. Catherine remembered certain patterns she had learned during her training. It all pointed to one terrifying truth. Alisa's mother-in-law was the one responsible for the black magic. She rushed back to Alisa and, with a grave expression, whispered, "Alisa, it's your mother-in-law. She's the one doing all this to you." Alisa's eyes widened in shock. "No, no, that can't be true. She prays all day. She's always been kind to me." But deep down, Alisa remembered the strange glances, the moments her mother-in-law spoke to herself, and the odd herbs she often brought into the house. Catherine took a deep breath and explained, "Black magic is often hidden behind the guise of devotion. She knows what she's doing. She's using dark forces to control you and your life." Tears filled Alisa's eyes as she whispered, "But why? Why would she do this to me?" Catherine looked at her with sympathy. "Maybe it's jealousy, maybe control, or maybe she doesn't want you to have a happy life with her son. Sometimes people use dark magic out of fear of losing power over their loved ones." Alisa broke down into "I always felt something was off, but I ignored it. I thought I was imagining things." Catherine hugged her tightly. "We'll fight this, Alisa. Now that we know the truth, we can stop it." Little did they know, the mother-in-law was not as unaware as she seemed. Somewhere in the darkness she was watching and waiting. A few days later, Alisa's husband returned from his business trip, unaware of the horrors that had unfolded in his absence. As he entered the house, he noticed the uneasiness in Alisa's eyes and the nervous glances she exchanged with Catherine. The atmosphere was heavy, and it didn't take long for him to realize that something was wrong. Alisa, hesitant yet determined, sat him down and recounted everything that had happened in his absence. The strange occurrences, the attacks, and the discovery that his mother might be behind the black magic, tormenting their lives. Catherine stood silently by her side, clutching her Bible tightly, ready to support Alisa as she revealed the painful truth. As soon as Alisa finished speaking, her husband's face turned red with anger. "What nonsense is this, Alisa?" he snapped, his voice trembling with disbelief. He turned towards Catherine, his eyes filled with suspicion and rage. "How dare you accuse my mother of such a thing? She's a pious woman. She's the only one who has ever cared for me and this family." Catherine remained calm and tried to reason with him. "I know this is hard to believe, but I've seen the signs, the disturbances, the dark energy, and the fact that your mother was unaffected by it all. It's not a coincidence. She—" Before she could finish, Alisa's husband stood up abruptly, his face contorted with rage. Enough, he bellowed. I will not tolerate these accusations against my mother. She prays day and night for our well-being, and you come here and fill my wife's mind with lies? Elisa tried to calm him down, pleading with him to understand. Please, listen to us. I've been suffering, and Catherine has helped me. We need to face the truth, she begged, tears streaming down her face. But her husband's love and devotion for his mother were too strong. No, Elisa, this woman has poisoned your mind, he shouted, pointing at Catherine. Without another word, he stormed towards Catherine, grabbed her arm, and forcibly pushed her toward the door. Catherine stumbled but remained composed. I only wanted to help, she whispered, looking at Elisa one last time before the door slammed shut behind her. As Catherine stood outside in the cold night air, she could hear Elisa's muffled sobs from inside. She took a deep breath, looking up at the dark sky. She knew Elisa was in grave danger, and this wasn't over yet. With a heavy heart, Catherine returned to the church. The weight of Elisa's suffering and the rejection she had faced gnawed at her. As soon as she entered the church, she rushed to Father Joseph, her eyes filled with concern and frustration. Father, I need to talk to you, Catherine said urgently, sitting across from him in the quiet confession room. Father Joseph looked at her with keen but watchful eyes. What happened, child? You look troubled. Catherine took a deep breath and began explaining everything, from Elisa's struggles to the strange disturbances in her house, and finally to the shocking revelation that Elisa's mother-in-law was behind the black magic. She detailed how Elisa's husband had refused to believe the truth and thrown her out of the house. Father Joseph listened carefully, nodding slowly. When Catherine finished, she looked at him expectantly, hoping for guidance. Father, Elisa is in danger. I know it. I have to help her. Father sighed, his expression thoughtful. Catherine, we cannot force anyone to believe the truth. You have done your part by warning them, and now it is their choice whether they accept it or not. His voice was calm but firm. Catherine shook her head, frustration seeping into her voice. But Father, Elisa is terrified, and I can feel that the evil inside that house is growing stronger. How can I just sit here and do nothing? Father Joseph placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. My child, sometimes those under the influence of dark forces are unable to see the truth. It is very likely that Elisa's husband himself is affected by the magic his mother is practicing. That is why he cannot accept the reality. Black magic clouds the mind and blinds the soul. Tears welled up in Catherine's eyes. What should I do now, Father? I can't abandon her. Father Joseph smiled gently. We will not abandon her, but we must be patient. Continue your prayers and studies here. The power of darkness is not eternal. It weakens over time. When Elisa's husband starts feeling the burden of the dark magic, he will seek you out. That will be the time to help them. Catherine wiped her tears and nodded reluctantly. Deep down, she knew Father Joseph was right, but waiting felt like the hardest thing to do. As she left the room, she silently prayed for Elisa's safety, knowing that the battle was far from over. It was a cold, silent night. Catherine sat alone in the dimly lit church, deep in prayer. Her thoughts were consumed by Elisa's suffering and the dark forces that still haunted her. The flickering candlelight cast eerie shadows on the stone walls as she recited verses, seeking divine guidance to protect Elisa. Suddenly, an eerie wind swept through the church, rattling the stained glass windows violently. The old wooden doors creaked, and the once peaceful atmosphere turned ominous. Catherine's heart pounded in her chest as the gusts of wind grew stronger, making the candle flames tremble and flicker out one by one. The silence was shattered by the loud, thunderous banging of the church windows. The heavy iron chandeliers swayed above, creaking with the force of the wind. Catherine clutched her rosary tightly, fear creeping into her heart. She knew something unnatural was happening. Just as she rose to check the doors, they burst open with a deafening crash. A figure staggered into the church, his footsteps echoing across the sacred space. Catherine gasped, stepping back in alarm. It was Elisa's husband. His clothes were disheveled, his hair unkempt, and his eyes wild with terror. Before Catherine could say anything, he lunged toward her. Instinctively, she raised her hands in defense, thinking he had come to harm her. Her heart pounded as she whispered a desperate prayer under her breath. But instead of attacking her, he fell to his knees at her feet, his face drenched in sweat and his body trembling violently. "Save me! Sister Catherine! Save me!" he cried out, his voice hoarse and desperate. His entire body shivered as if an invisible force was crushing his soul. She's not my mother anymore. She's a monster. She's controlling everything," he sobbed uncontrollably, clutching her habit with trembling hands. Catherine looked down at him, realizing the dark magic's grip had finally loosened enough for him to see the truth. She knelt beside him, placing a hand on his head and whispering, "Have faith, my child. We will fight this together." The wind outside howled louder, but inside the church a new battle had just begun, one that Catherine knew would test every ounce of her faith and strength. Elisa's husband, still shaking with fear, looked up at Catherine with tear-filled eyes. "Sister, I was blind, but now I see the truth," he whispered. "My mother, she's not who I thought she was. She's a magician, an evil one. She's controlling Elisa, torturing her. I heard her speaking to something in the dark, summoning things." He shuddered, his voice breaking. Catherine took a deep breath, her heart heavy yet determined. "We don't have much time. We must save Elisa before it's too late," she said firmly. Without hesitation, they rushed to Elisa's house. The moment Catherine stepped inside, an overpowering darkness filled the air. The house was eerily silent, but the heavy tension hinted at an impending danger. As they crept inside, they heard muffled cries coming from the basement. Catherine's eyes widened in horror. "She's down there," Elisa's husband whispered urgently. Descending the creaky stairs, they were met with a chilling sight. Elisa was tied to a chair in the middle of the room, her face pale and filled with terror. Her mother-in-law stood before her, chanting in a deep, guttural voice, holding strange objects in her hands. The shadows around her twisted unnaturally, and Catherine knew she wasn't alone. Dark forces surrounded her. "You shouldn't have come here, Sister Catherine," the old woman hissed, her eyes gleaming with malice. With a flick of her hand, an invisible force hurled Elisa's husband against the wall, knocking him unconscious. Catherine stepped forward, clutching her cross tightly. "Your evil ends tonight," she declared boldly. The battle began. The magician whispered incantations, and dark figures emerged from the shadows. Sinister, whispering entities with glowing red eyes. They lunged at Catherine, but she stood her ground, raising her cross and reciting powerful prayers. Holy light radiated from her, pushing back the dark creatures. Catherine's voice grew stronger with each verse, her faith acting as a shield against the sinister forces. The old woman screeched in fury, summoning even greater dark energy. But Catherine did not waver. With a final commanding prayer, a brilliant light engulfed the room, dispelling the evil spirits and rendering the magician powerless. The old woman fell to the ground, writhing in agony as Catherine approached her. "Your darkness holds no power here," Catherine whispered, before sprinkling holy water upon her, breaking the curse. Elisa gasped as the dark grip over her finally loosened and tears of relief streamed down her face. Catherine untied her and held her close. "You're safe now," she assured her. With the battle won, Catherine knew evil had been defeated, but she remained vigilant, knowing that darkness always lurked, waiting for another chance. As Catherine's powerful prayers filled the air, the black magician let out a piercing scream. Her frail body trembled violently under the force of Catherine's spiritual strength. The dark forces she had summoned began to crumble under the divine light emanating from Catherine's unwavering faith. The old woman staggered backward, clutching her chest. Her eyes, once filled with malice and power, now reflected pure terror. "No, this cannot be," she screeched, her voice distorted and unnatural. Suddenly, blood began to trickle from her mouth, and her face contorted in agony. Catherine continued reciting sacred verses, her voice growing louder, drowning out the magician's wails. The old woman's body began to decay before their eyes, her skin turning dark and cracking, peeling away like dried leaves. Her bones twisted unnaturally, and a foul stench filled the air. Shadows that once protected her recoiled in fear, fleeing the holy presence surrounding Catherine. Elisa and her husband watched in horror, clutching each other as the room trembled. The lights in the house flickered uncontrollably, and then, with a final burst of energy, they exploded, plunging the entire house into darkness. The only source of light now was the divine glow surrounding Catherine, her cross shimmering in the darkness. With a final anguished cry, the black magician collapsed onto the ground. Her body continued to rot and disintegrate, turning into ashes that scattered across the floor. The evil that had plagued Elisa's life for so long was finally defeated. The suffocating darkness that had filled the house dissipated, leaving behind a silence so profound that it felt like the house itself was breathing again. Elisa sobbed in relief, falling into her husband's arms. The invisible chains that had bound their lives were finally broken. "It's over," Elisa whispered, tears of gratitude streaming down her face. Her husband, now fully aware of the truth, embraced her tightly, vowing never to let darkness enter their lives again. Catherine looked around, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had faced darkness and emerged victorious. With a silent prayer of thanks, she left the house, feeling a renewed strength within her soul. Back at the church, Catherine knelt before the altar, her faith stronger than ever. She knew that her spiritual journey had just begun, and with every battle, her strength and connection to God would only grow. She was no longer just Sister Catherine. She was now a warrior of light, ready to stand against the forces of darkness wherever they arose.